Hello, I'm Jack Grady, and on behalf of the Archives and History Committee of the First Baptist Church on the Square in LaGrange, Georgia, we welcome Vietnam veteran Ford McLain, and we thank him for his service to our country and also to our church. Ford, we do thank you so much for your willingness to come and talk about your experience during the Vietnam period. And we'll just sit here and chat a little bit about that. So I do appreciate you. And
it's good to be here, Jack.
Thank you very much for coming today. Let me just ask a few questions, and we'll just sit and chat.
Okay.
Were you drafted, or did you volunteer to go into service during that Vietnam period?
Well, the college that I attended in New York didn't have an ROTC program. So after college, I was drafted.
I see. Okay.
And of course, that was in 1966, and we all knew when we graduated from college we were going to be drafted.
You had already, of course, signed up.
Oh yes,
you had to.
The minute you hit 18, you had to sign up.
Sure. Right. Okay. So they called your number.
They did. I got married, and then was drafted shortly thereafter.
Oh boy!
And so I went to Fort Jackson, North Carolina. Where's that? South Carolina? I forget. I think it's South Carolina.
I believe it is.
Where we went through like a replacement depot, and they gave us our shots, and we took tests and that sort of thing.
Yes. And
then I thought we was going to take basic training there, but then they sent us to Fort Hood, Texas.
Oh.
Now this is February of 1966, and it was freezing at Fort Jackson. So when I heard I was going to go to Fort Hood, Texas, I said, "Wow!" I'm thinking of John Wayne and the Searchers and sunny Texas. There was 18 inches of snow on the ground when I got there.
Was it really 18 inches of snow?
So I went through basic training at Fort Hood, Texas, and I had been pretty much an average student in high school and college. Certainly wasn't the big man on campus or anything like that. And so I was in a student platoon at Fort Hood, Texas, going through basic training. And we had the sergeant was in charge of teaching us close order drill. And he had a student up there, a trainee, and giving how to do column left and column right, and the poor kid that was up there was tripping all over himself. I felt it like the Lord grabbed my hand and raised it up from the back of the platoon and said, "Would you like somebody up there that can do that?" And so the sergeant said, "Oh, smart Alec, get up here." So my dad had taught me all of this when I was just a wee boy.
Really?
So I got up there and he said, "All right, forward march, column left, column right," and I did it all. And the next thing you know, I was a squad leader.
Yeah. And
the next thing you know, I was a platoon leader for the training platoon.
I see. Oh boy.
And so from that point on, everything that I did in the military seemed to turn out okay.
Yeah, it came naturally and easily.
It was easy for me.
Yeah.
And
because of your relationship with your father in doing these things.
He had taught me, was a World War II Navy veteran, and he had taught me manual of arms with a Springfield rifle and all of that sort of thing. So basic training was a breeze for me.
Good.
And when I finished, I was retained. They call it train and retain.
Yeah.
And I was retained in that company, and I became the company commander's Jeep driver.
Oh, I see.
He was a nice enough fella. He's a lieutenant. And one day we were driving along, and we were talking about Roman history or something. And I said, "Yeah, I had a course in Roman history in college." He said, "Oh, you have a college education?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, why didn't you go to OCS?" And I said, "I'm putting my 2 years in, and I'm getting out."
Okay.
And so the next thing you know, the first sergeant called me in, and he says that the company commander has made us fill these papers out for you to go to OCS. I said, "I'm not going to OCS." He said, look, just sign the papers. We'll send them in. If you don't want to go, you just refuse. I said, okay. So yes, First Sergeant, I did what I was told. I signed my name. Well, about a month later, I didn't get a letter saying, you're accepted. Do you want to go? I got orders.
Did you really?
And the order said, you will report to OCS. So I went up to Fort Knox and spent 6 months in officer candidate school and got out and was commissioned to second lieutenant armor. So,
where's Fort Knox?
Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Kentucky, yeah, okay.
It's right outside of Louisville, Kentucky.
Sure.
Or as they say up there, Louisville.
Oh, okay.
And so I went, and of all places, after being commissioned, they sent me back to Fort Hood, Texas. The Army, in its wisdom, I'd put in for, send me to Germany, send me someplace, Hawaii.
You're ready to go.
They sent me to Fort Hood, Texas. So I spent 2 years in Fort Hood.
Okay, training the other
I
guy.
was basically, I was in a battalion. I had, in those days, the battalion was primarily all run by lieutenants with one lieutenant commander, a lieutenant colonel was the battalion commander, and then there were maybe 10 lieutenants. Everybody else was in Vietnam.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So we got interesting jobs. I was a platoon leader, a company commander, a battalion adjutant, battalion executive officer, all of those jobs as a lieutenant. And it was very frustrating. For some reason, orders never came down sending me to Vietnam. And we thought that we were going to go to Vietnam.
Anytime.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Well, I managed to survive 2 years at Fort Hood. And I said, I'm getting out of the Army. This is, I've had enough of this. It was, we always were less than 80% strength. We couldn't get the parts we needed to repair our tanks.
Oh, really?
And because all these parts and things were going to Vietnam.
Yeah, sure.
So anyway, I was out of the military for about 8 months. And an interesting story, but I'll not mention that. But
sure.
But through an interesting little situation within the family, I volunteered to go back in the military and go to Vietnam.
Okay, you volunteered now at this point.
At that point, I said,
You had been ready earlier.
I missed the military, and I was working in New York City, managing a restaurant, and things were going well. But I felt that what I had been doing in the military was more important than managing a restaurant.
Yeah, at that time anyway.
So I went back in the Army in October of 1969.
That's interesting.
And I got out 20 years later.
20 years later.
So
But you did. You're going to tell me about your experience from there, I'm sure.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
What happened was, of course, this was 1969. Vietnam was still going strong, and so I volunteered to go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they promoted me to captain and sent me to a special forces type school at John F. Kennedy Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Okay.
And so I went through that school and studied Vietnamese and other things they teach special forces people about weapons and communications and first aid, that sort of thing. And then I went to Vietnam, and I spent a year in Vietnam and as an advisor to the South Vietnamese Army.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it was, as I had mentioned earlier, it's the only war we had, and it was a dirty little, crummy little, nasty war. Certainly not as clean cut as World War II. Historically, World War II was moving forward. You always knew where the forward edge of the battle area was.
Yes.
The enemy was that direction. In Vietnam, the enemy was all around you.
Oh, man.
And it was very difficult to discriminate
who
were the good guys and who were the bad guys.
Yes.
They all wore pajamas and they all looked the same, only some of them were trying to kill you. So we did our best there, and I managed to get out with my skin, a little wounded here and there. And after Vietnam, I put in for a transfer to go directly from Vietnam to Germany.
Oh, things were heating up in the European area.
I just, actually it was a selfish move. If you spend a year in Vietnam or a year out of the country, when you got to Germany, you got credit for being out of the country for a year. So your name went on the housing list a year earlier.
Oh.
So actually, when I got to Germany, I lived in temporary quarters for about 2 weeks and went straight into government quarters.
Oh, boy. I see.
And by that time, I had a wife and 2 children, and we spent our time in Germany. I was a company commander. I got my second.
You brought them over there.
Tank company. We all went over together.
Okay. Wonderful.
And enjoyed the. See, in Vietnam, I'd been in an infantry organization. In Germany, I was in an armor organization, which is what my branch was.
I see. Okay.
So I was an armor officer, and so I went into a tank battalion in Germany.
And where were you located?
I was in Bamberg, Germany, which is about 50 miles from the Czechoslovakian border, which is where the Fulda Gap was. That was supposed to be one of if the balloon ever went up and the Soviets ever attacked, part of where they would come through was the Fulda Gap. So most of our experience there was preparing for or defending against the Russians.
To be prepared for
be
that.
prepared.
Yeah.
Of course, they never came, and so that was it.
Yeah.
And I spent 3 years in Germany, and then I had various tours. I went and taught ROTC. I taught military history.
Did you really?
At the University of San Francisco.
Oh, good.
And
but you were still in the Army.
Still in the Army. Stayed in the Army until 1987, and. After the ROTC business, teaching there, I went back to Fort Hood again.
Did you?
And it was.
That must have been interesting going back after all that period of time.
If you break down my military career, the 21 years I spent 7 years at Fort Hood, a total of 7 years in Germany, and then 7 years at a variety of other places.
Interesting, yeah.
So. Fort Hood got more than its share of me. I think I had a total of 3 tours at Fort Hood.
Wow.
But
Fort Hood, is that in what they call the hill country of Texas?
Well, actually, you're thinking, I think, Jack, of the hill country is around Austin. Fort Hood is in what they call Central Texas.
Yeah.
It's near Temple, Texas.
Okay.
The town outside of Fort Hood is Killeen.
Right.
And there's really no reason to go there unless you're in the military.
Okay.
There's no industry. I think there's some farming, but mostly cattle they raise in the middle of Texas.
Yeah.
So Fort Hood is not exactly the garden spot of the Western world. But I did enjoy my time at Fort Hood. I think that the beauty of the military is that there's such variety. One time, you'll serve as a logistics officer for a year, and then in that same organization you may go and be the training and operations officer for another year.
Oh, I see. So you do have a lot of variety.
And then although I was an armor officer, my secondary specialty was personnel management. So I was a personnel officer.
I see.
Various times in the military.
Yes. So good background of training, really an education in itself, wasn't it? Your military experience.
The military, they teach you several things. But first off is that you're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're a soldier. So when I was commanding a company, if Sergeant Jones went to jail for drunken disorderly, 3 in the morning I'd get a phone call, I had to go get him out. Or if Sergeant Smith was arrested for domestic disturbance, beaten up on his wife, I would have to go down. Not only would I have to pull him out of jail, but I'd have to counsel him and his wife and try to get them to understand that that's not the way you solve problems, is to beat up on each other.
It sounds like that was something that you could not delegate.
That's right. So you learn in the military that you're in the service 24 hours a day. And I think when you finally get out of the military, whether you're in a short time or like I was for 21 years, you bring with you that sense of commitment to your job, whatever it is.
Sure.
I've never had an hourly job where I got paid by the hour. I was always a salaried employee where working 60, 70 hours a week was just normal.
Well, sure.
because of the military background.
Yes.
So anyway, after I left Fort Hood, I went to Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth, Kansas. People say, oh, you spent time at Leavenworth, and they think the prison.
Yeah, but I know about this college there.
Command and General Staff College is at Leavenworth. And while I got there, and I figured I had maybe 4 years left in the military. I had been about 15 or 16 years in the military. And I knew that I would never get back to Germany again. So I took, my wife and I went on leave for 30 days, and we traveled all over Europe.
Oh, good.
And then I got back and went to Leavenworth, and orders came down. I was going back to Germany. So we were sure that vacation would be the only opportunity we'd have to explore Europe and not have to worry about heavy expenses, because we caught a military hop going over there.
I see.
But lo and behold, the Army in its wisdom sent me from Leavenworth directly to Germany, and that's where I spent my last 4 years.
I see.
I was the director of the Army Research Institute for Behavioral and Social Sciences.
Really?
They had
you had a broad education, didn't you?
Well, in the midst of all that, the Army had sent me for a master's degree. So I got a master's degree in psychology. And it was because of that master's degree that I got the job with the Army Research Institute in Heidelberg, Germany. Wow. So I spent my last 4 years in the military in Heidelberg, Germany. I was supposed to go there for 3 years, and they asked me if I'd stay 1 more year. So I did that, and I retired from Heidelberg, and I went to work for Boeing Aerospace in Seattle, Washington, when I got out of the military.
Good.
So I think I've just condensed 21 years
it's
into
not
10
easy
minutes.
to do either, but that's a fascinating career. But I have to ask you, going back to the Vietnam experience, you said you had learned some of the language. So did you actually get involved in face-to-face meetings or conversations with some of the Vietnamese?
As an advisor, the reason they had me study Vietnamese before I went over there was because I was not going to an American unit. In an American unit, all you have to worry about speaking English, and you're dealing with other Americans, but as an advisor, you have a small group of Americans, and then you're working primarily as an advisor to the Vietnamese. So my Vietnamese language skills were fairly good at that point. Now, I couldn't discuss philosophy, but I could say, this is how you set up an L-shaped ambush. Here's where you put your machine guns.
Yes.
I want to call in artillery this way. I could say all that in Vietnamese. But I couldn't discuss philosophy or the weather or the more mundane things. Of course, I did know how to say, when is supper time, or what are we going to eat? That sort of thing. You learn, you pick that up as you go along. I did deal day in and day out with the Vietnamese people, and I found them to be wonderful, fun-loving, good, just like anybody else, wonderful folks. There was a problem with cultures because we, of a European culture, tend to look at time in a linear fashion. If you miss an opportunity, it's gone. It never comes again. The Asian mind, or their culture, they see things in a circular fashion. So time is not, if you miss it, you'll never see it again. It comes back around, and you can catch it the next time around.
Another opportunity there.
And what that translates to is we Westerners have a sense of urgency. Got to get it done today. And in Asia, particularly in my association with the Vietnamese, it was, don't worry about it. We'll get to it. There's no rush. Well, in combat, there's always a rush. So it's kind of difficult to be patient with people who don't have the same sense of urgency that you do. So that's, I would say, when I left Asia, I had no desire to go back and to deal with that culture again. Of course, I like knives and forks too. I did pretty well with chopsticks, but I like European food.
Oh, sure. Well, I can understand that. You remind me of something when you're talking about the relationship with the people there, the Vietnamese people, and their makeup and the way they think. I think I told you earlier that I had an older brother who was a career man in the Army, and during World War II, he was in the China, Burma, India theater of operation, and he told me later that one of his responsibilities was to train some of the Chinese soldiers. But he said his biggest problem with them was that they tended to tell you what they thought you wanted to hear.
That's right. Very gracious people. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting that just not too long ago, there was an airplane crash. China Airlines, I guess, or something, Asian airline, had a crash out in San Francisco. And there were 3 qualified pilots.
Oh, yes.
Well, one of the criticisms or possible reasons for the crash was that they had known that they were too low. But the Asian culture is, if I tell you you're doing something wrong, you may lose face. And so for one pilot to tell the other one, no, you're doing this wrong, it would be losing face. So it could have been, and this is just a theory, but it could have been that because of that Asian cultural aspect, they may have been aware of the problem, but hesitated to criticize the other pilot.
That is interesting.
And we had the same problems as advisors to the Vietnamese people. You had to be careful how you said things, because if someone was doing something and they were flat wrong, you knew that was incorrect. You had to tell them in a way that didn't offend them.
Let me ask you one other question. When the war finally ended in Vietnam. Where were you?
I was in Germany.
Okay.
When I think it was 73 or 74 when the war finally wound down, and they had I think they called it the Treaty of Paris. Paris peace talks.
I see. Okay.
So I was over there, and then that was the time when the Army had decided to have what they called VOLAR, the Volunteer Army. Up until that time, we were all drafted. And so out of a company of 100 guys, I may have had 30 who were enlisted, volunteered for the military. The rest may have been drafted.
Yes.
Well, as soon as they got out gradually, and we had the volunteer army, and like it is today, all the soldiers in the army are now volunteers.
Yes.
So you can't say, well, you were drafted, you don't want to be here. You volunteered to be here.
Yeah. And there is a difference.
It is a big difference.
A significant difference. Well, you've shared with us some interesting experiences that you had, not only in Vietnam, but other areas as well, like the time in Germany. And I do appreciate your doing this with us and sharing for the project that we have going on here in our church. Let me ask you just a couple of questions about your church relationship. You've been here, a member of this church, for quite a number of years, haven't you?
Just about 20 years.
20 years. Good. One other thing that occurred to me while you were talking, too, about all of these experiences, these wonderful experiences you had, just an education in itself. How would you say that your military experience prepared you for the rest of your life?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the sense of commitment to a job. You always feel that if I have a responsibility, I take it seriously. If I tell someone I'm going to meet them at a certain time, I'm there. If I commit to being responsible for a committee or for some organization, and I accept that responsibility, I'm going to be committed to making it happen. I think probably that sense of duty, responsibility, is probably the most salient feature of my military career that I've kept with me. See, now I've been out of the Army longer than I was in the Army.
Yes, then you served, but that still is with you. It's a part of your makeup.
I believe so, yes.
Yes.
And you know, there's a certain amount of discipline in my daily routine. I get up at 6 o'clock every morning.
Do you?
I mean, most people, when they retire,
sleep in.
They sleep in. It's just my nature to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I like to read, and I'll read until 11, 12 o'clock at night and still get up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Good. That's interesting. I'm trying to think if there's something else that we might need to bring into this experience, these experiences. I think if there's anything else you'd like to add, now's the time. We'll just kind of wrap this up. Any other experiences you had, or thoughts that you have about your time in service?
You know, since we're discussing this in the context of a church organization, I'll say this as a matter of personal disclosure, if you will. I think that while I was in the military, I used being a soldier as an excuse for not being a good Christian. I thought of it in terms of, well, you know, you're in the military, you got to act a certain way. You got to be tough. You got to drink. You got to have a foul mouth, and maybe that part of that was a product of youth as well as being in the military.
Well, yes, could
but
be.
I've found that the closer I got to the Lord as I matured in my Christian walk, the more I realized that you don't have to do those things to be a good soldier.
Yes.
And that the Lord's going to guide you through the decisions that you have to make if you rely on Him rather than rely on yourself. The military tells you, you can do anything. Make it happen. And the Bible tells you, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.
Great. That's
so
great.
It's important to recognize that you have to be self-reliant, but recognize that it's Christ is the source of your strength.
Yes, that's an excellent commentary, and I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you, Ford. Thank you so much for sitting with me and talking about your experience in the military. I want to thank Paul Barnes, too, because he's actually doing the recording of this interview, and I want to tell you that he will make 4 copies of this DVD. One will be kept downstairs in the Heritage Room. It'll be maintained there by our Archives and History Committee at the church. Another copy will be placed in the church library so that members of our church can check it out just as they do a book there in the library.
Very good.
It'll be available there in the years to come even. The 3rd copy will go downtown to the museum on Main. They have asked us to share this with them as well. And the 4th copy will be given to you for your own use with your family, whichever way you want to share it.
Thank you, Jack. I've enjoyed this time. We've had to
Appreciate
share
you.
some information.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you.